Good afternoon, everyone. I think people are still coming in, so let's wait for a couple of minutes maybe. Okay. Okay. So good afternoon again, everyone, and welcome back to this lecture. The topic of today is multilingualism and language contact. So we talk about people and societies using more than one language. Okay. First, I would like to give you a few keywords so you can maybe better follow what is coming next. We will talk today about things like monolingualism, bilingualism, and multilingualism. Now, in all these words, you have the lingualism, which of course is about language. So lingualism means the number of languages that a person or a community uses. Monolingualism is only one language. Mono means one, and actually monolingualism is already a bilingual word formation because mono is Greek for one or single, and lingua is Latin for language. So mono, Greek, lingualism, Latin. This is already sort of code mixing, two languages mixed together. Then bilingualism, I don't know why this is not staying here. Okay, something wrong with the stylus, it seems. Bilingualism means two languages are used by the same person or community, and multilingualism, many languages. Then usually a person, an individual, has one native language, one first language, and we call them then native speakers of that language. L1 and L2 means first language, second language. Of course, there may be L3, L4, or as many languages as you can think of. But usually in the literature, we talk about L1 and L2 for first and second language. When there are more than one languages in use by an individual or a community, usually one of the languages is dominant, is more important, has more weight in several aspects. And the other language or languages are subordinate. That means they are of lesser importance. They are less used, maybe, are less functional. When there are more than one language in a scenario when people communicate, there is what you call language contact. The languages come together, the languages are in contact with each other. When there is language contact, these languages influence each other in a way that one language can be called the source language, the language that gives some material to another language, and the target language is the language that receives material from a language. In some cases, when you have access to more than one language or one linguistic code, you may do what is called code mixing. Like you mix the languages. You use words of one language within a conversation of another language. So I could now use some Burmese words when speaking English, and this would be code mixing, if I mix Burmese with English. Actually, you may do this in your everyday lives. You may use English words when you speak Burmese for things that you cannot think of the Burmese word at the moment. Now, when this happens, when languages are in contact and there is code mixing occurring, then you can end up having borrowing. So one language borrows things from another language. In borrowing, we have basically two different things, namely matter borrowing and pattern borrowing. Okay, now it stays here, interesting. Matter borrowing means you take over the matter, the word, with its sound material. So basically, when you speak of matter borrowing, we call this loan words. So if in Burmese you use an English word like discount bede, discount shide, discount is an English word with English sound and English meaning. So you borrow the whole thing as a matter, like an object you borrow. Pattern borrowing, on the other hand, is when you just borrow the way of putting things together. So you may borrow the way of making a sentence out of words, but using your own material. We will see examples of this in Burmese and languages of Myanmar in the lecture on Friday. A word about this borrowing. Many linguists say that we should not speak of borrowing in this case, because when you borrow something, you give it back at some point. Now, if in Burmese you borrow English words like telephone or discount or account, you don't give it back to English later. You keep it in Burmese usually. So some people say borrowing is not really correct, but this terminology is well established in the literature. So I think we can use it, although it's not really correct. Then the last word here, convergence. Convergence happens when languages become more similar to each other. So there is not borrowing from language A to language B, but the languages just assimilate to each other as the speakers are in permanent contact. So these are a few words, a few key terms that you should keep in mind as we go on now and look at some details and some theory about language contact and multilingualism. Now, you may think that multilingual speakers or multilingual communities is an exception. You may think that one individual normally speaks one language, but this is not the case. Actually, monolingualism is the exception. It's not the rule. Across the world, most people do, at least to some extent, have some multilingualism. That means you are exposed to or you use more than one language in your everyday communication. The languages that you may use in your communication, they can be either very similar, they can be varieties of the same language or dialects of the same language, or they can be very different. So a person may speak different or be exposed to different English varieties, like a British person living in America may speak British English with their parents, but American English while outside. Or a Chinese citizen or Chinese by origin may live in the United States and speak Chinese with their parents and American English outside. So there is no limit to the relatedness, the closeness or difference of the languages. Language contact can happen anywhere at any time with any kind of languages. Now, if we look at a multilingual community, this does not mean that in this community, everyone speaks more than one language. Different individuals in a multilingual community may have knowledge of different subsets of the languages spoken there. So if in a village, for example, people speak English, French, and German, that does not mean that everyone speaks English, French, and German. But some individuals may speak only English, others only German. Some may speak English and French, some may speak French and German. But still the whole community is seen as a multilingual community. But anyway, if speakers meet in this community, they will always try to make themselves understood. So they will always try to speak the language that the hearer understands as well. Of course, humans are not perfect, as we have seen. So if you speak different languages, you may end up mixing these languages unconsciously. You may just use, if you speak both German and English, you may use German words in your English, or you may use German syntax in your English, or the other way around, without even noticing. So if you speak both languages, there is always a conflict because you have both or more than one systems in your brain. Now, why is it interesting at all to study language contact, multilingualism? Why is this a topic that we want to talk about? First, when languages come in contact, they always leave traces in the other languages. So contact always leads to some way of language change, and this can tell us something about the history of the speakers of the languages. So even if there is no contact anymore at the moment, but you can still see traces of older contact, that tells us something about the societies, about the speakers in these societies. Then language contact, the way of languages interact in a society, can also tell us something about what groups there are in any society and what their relative positions are in society. Which group is considered higher in the hierarchy, which group is considered like prestige group, and which groups are considered lower in the hierarchy of this specific society. So by looking at language contact, we can learn a lot about the makeup of the society. Then we also learn something about how the society functions as a whole. Like who speaks which language in which context, or which language is used generally in which context. This tells us something how the society works and lives together. And then also language contact is important because it can tell us something how we do language, how we understand language, how we produce language. So it can tell us something about how our brain works, how language is processed in our brains. And this, of course, also will have an impact on how we work with language these days in terms of language technology. Where does language contact occur? Where does it happen? Now, if you say language contact can be there in society or in individuals. So we saw that we can have multilingual communities or we can have multilingual individuals. In each case, of course, there is more than one language that the society or individual use in communication. Now, very important, language contact, especially today, does not necessarily mean that the speakers are in contact, that the cultures or the societies are in contact. So all of you are at least bilingual to some extent. All of you speak, understand, read, write English, at least to some extent. Many of you may never have been outside of Myanmar. Many of you may never have been to an English-speaking country. Some of you may not even have had interaction with English-speaking foreigners. So you don't need the direct contact for language contact. Language contact can happen if you just use the internet, if you use Facebook, if you watch videos or music on English websites, on YouTube, whatever. Then you hear English and you may pick up some English just from this. So language contact can be virtual, doesn't have to be concrete in the real world. What happens very often when language contact occurs or happens is that the languages influence each other. As you have seen, this borrowing, pattern borrowing from a source language, some elements, these can be words or can be just structures, ways of putting words together. These can be transmitted from language A to language B in the interaction of these languages. And very often, this transmission happens unconsciously. The speakers don't know that they use something from a foreign language in many contexts. This is especially the case with pattern borrowing, much less with loan words, matter borrowing. If you use an English word in Burmese, you usually know that it's not Burmese because the sounds are different, the word structure may be different. But you may end up using some English patterns in Burmese without even noticing it. Or you may use some Mon or Shan or Karen patterns in Burmese without noticing it. We will get back to this in the next lecture when you look at more details of Myanmar. In all cases, it is individual speakers who do this language change. Language contact always happens within the speaker, within an individual speaker. Remember, language only exists in a society by being used by speakers. Language is not an object that is there in society, but it only happens when speakers use it. And it always begins in the brain of a speaker. So it's always individual speakers who do this. Now, if you have a closer look at multilingual individuals, people who speak or have access to more than one language system in their brain. Now, a very important point is that to be considered multilingual individuals does not necessarily mean that you are fluent in all these languages. So some of you may be fluent in English, some may just know enough English to follow a lecture, to read a textbook, or to use the internet in English. But still, you're multilingual because you have access to English and Burmese, at least. Many of you will also have access to other languages like Mon, Shan, Chengpo, Chin varieties, or something else. But it's enough if you have only partial access to language. You can take English loanwords into your Burmese without being fluent in English. Now, a very important point is that these language systems that you have access to, they are not stored in separate pockets in the brain. It's not like you have one part of the brain that is for English and one part that is for Burmese. It's just your brain, and everything is mixed up in your brain. So if you speak 2 or more languages, you just have a bigger inventory of linguistic patterns, linguistic knowledge in your brain. And that covers everything of all the languages you know, like the lexicon, phonology, syntax, morphology, pragmatics, everything is in your brain. So this is very important to know that it is not different parts of the brain. You don't have separate Burmese module and English module in your brain, but it's just one language module, which is filled with different knowledges of different languages. Now, also in an individual multilingual speaker, one of the languages is usually dominant. It's the language that is the most important in the brain. Now, this status of dominant language can change. It can change over time. Like when you're a child, you may be more fluent in Shan than when you go to school and you start learning Burmese at school. You start using more Burmese, then Burmese may become the dominant language in your life. But this status of dominant language, most important language, can also change according to the context. Now imagine you speak English pretty fluently and also Burmese. You're at home, you speak with your family. Of course, Burmese will be dominant in your brain because your surroundings are Burmese. You speak Burmese. Now you go to a conference and there are many non-Burmese speakers there and you speak English the whole day. So English at this moment is more dominant in your brain. It may be easier for you to think of English expressions than Burmese expressions. That can also happen if actually your Burmese is much better than your English, if you're more fluent in Burmese than in English. But just the context can change the temporary status of English to dominant language. So this all happens in your brain. You have these languages in your brain, in your head, and that means language contact happens right in your head. Language contact, of course, you can hear it in a society that people speak different languages, but when the languages really come together to influence each other, that's all in your head. That all happens in the brain of the multilingual speaker. So something is funny with, okay, now it's coming. So let's have a closer look at this. We have here speakers A and B. Speaker A speaks French, the yellow dots in her head, and English, the blue dots in her head. So we have French and English. Sometimes French and English overlap, like the words may be very similar or even the same. So here for French and here for French and English and English. And the overall language of the speaker, greenish here, is something of a mixture. So the language system that speaker A has in her head is both French and English. That's why I use green here, combining blue and yellow. Now speaker B, on the other side, has only access to English. So her language is bluish, her language system is bluish, and all the blue dots are elements of English. Elements can be words, can be constructions, anything. Now, the communication, when speaker A speaks to speaker B, they will certainly use English because speaker A, although she has access to French and English, she wants speaker B to understand her. And speaker B only knows English, so speaker A chooses English, of course. But because speaker A also knows French, she may use some French expressions in her English. She may use some French pronunciations or syntax in her English. So the English of speaker A is colored a bit by French. And this happens right in the head of speaker A, of course. Now, if you look at this contact scenario, as you know, language is used to transmit ideas from my head to your head. So I encode my ideas in language, and I try to do this as precisely as I can do, and also as easily as possible, because I'm lazy. But I still want the hearer to understand what I mean. So of all the language codes that I have access to in my head, I will choose the one that I think the hearer will understand most easily, or that I speak most easily and I know the hearer will understand. So this is a compromise that I want me to be as comfortable as possible, and I want you to be as comfortable as possible. So speaker A here will choose English because that's the only language that she shares with speaker B. Now, sometimes speaker A, when speaking English, may not be able to think of an English word in time. You know, when you speak, you don't really have much time to think about how to say it. Speaking is very fast. Speaking is very quick. You form the ideas in your brain, and then you give the orders to the muscles for articulation. And this all happens within like very, very short time. So sometimes when you're speaking, and then the English word doesn't come to your mind, but the French word comes to your mind first. So speaker A may then just use a French expression without even knowing that she's doing this. And if she is using a French word in her English, then this would be matter borrowing, or as it's also called, replication. Replication instead of borrowing, because you don't give it back usually. Or it can be just the way of putting words together, maybe using French word order instead of English word order. So this would then be pattern replication, using a French pattern in an English sentence using English words. This way of including expressions of a language other than the language of conversation, in this case including French expressions in English, is called code mixing. The two codes that you have in your head, in this case French and English, are mixed when speaking. Now, how much of this French comes into the conversation in English here by speaker A depends very much on which one is the dominant language in speaker A's brain. If French is the overall dominant language, if she speaks much better French than English, then there will be more French in her English. Also, if she just was hanging out with her French-speaking friends and spoke French for 2 hours, and now she's meeting an English-speaking friend, then French will be the temporarily dominant language. And in both cases, there will be more code mixing of French into her English. Now, can you hear me again now? I just saw that someone muted me. Okay.
Yeah. My bad.
Okay, yeah, you know?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, Jesuba. So I say Yabi and Jesuba in the English lecture here. This is code mixing. Now, very importantly, speaker B does not speak French. But if speaker A uses many French patterns or words in the conversation, speaker B may take in this French. She may just absorb some of the French of speaker A. And then speaker B's English may also become a little bit French, although speaker B does not speak French. And how much of this happens to speaker B, again, depends on the dominant language of the speaker A. And as we have seen, this dominant language status can change over time and can change within the situation. So you see, language contact is pretty complex in different ways. It depends on different factors involving the speaker, the hearer, and the whole social setting. Now, when this language contact happens, when languages are in contact, influence each other, you may ask, what parts of the language can be affected by this? Traditionally, up to maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, linguists thought that only the lexicon can be affected. That when languages are in contact with each other, the only thing that can happen is that you take words from a foreign language. So again, you all speak Burmese and you all use some English loan words in your Burmese, I'm sure. You all use things like telephone and computer. So linguists thought that this is the only way that the language can influence another language, giving words. But this is not true. And it has been shown over the last decades that any domain of the language, any part of the language can be affected by language contact. So the phonetics, phonology, the sound system of a language can change because of language contact. The structure of words, the morphology may change. Then the way you put your words together into a sentence, the syntax, may change because of language contact. The meanings of words may change. You may take over meanings that a word has in another language and also assign it to the same word in your language. So you get semantic extension. And then also the way of how you use language in communication may be affected by language contact. So the pragmatics may change. But it is still the case that loan words, lexical or matter borrowing is usually much easier done than morphology or syntax borrowing. Morphology is usually the most stable part in the language. So you don't easily take over morphemes or just morphology from another language. So in Burmese, again, you easily take English loan words. So again, it's no problem to use telepon or pon in Burmese, but it would be much more difficult. It would take much more time and more intensive contact for Burmese to take over the English plural, for example. So to say telephones, morphology is more stable, but basically everything can be affected. So let's have a look now at multilingual societies as opposed to multilingual individuals. I said the society can use more than one language in their everyday communication or in different parts of everyday communication. Usually, when in a society there is more than one language, their status will be asymmetric. Asymmetric means one language has maybe official status and the other language or languages do not have official status. One language may be considered high prestige, the others may be considered low prestige. So if in France, some people also speak non-French languages, they will usually speak French in all contexts because French is high prestige, and the local language they also speak will be low prestige, will have less importance in the society. So there is asymmetric statuses of these languages. Now, if in a society that uses more than one language, there are usually some or many individuals who speak both or all the languages used in the society. Others may speak only one, maybe monolingual. But if there are many multilingual speakers, then language contact happens in their heads, as we have seen. And then their changed language may spread to monolingual speakers, as we have seen in the example above of speaker A speaking French and English, and she speaks English to speaker B. Speaker B will then take over some of the French words or constructions, or she may copy the way of pronunciation. This usually happens unconsciously, but it leads to the whole community at some point speaking the target language, in this case English, with elements from a source language, in this case French. So multilingual speakers in a multilingual society may change the language of monolingual speakers in the same society. So if you have a society where some people speak French and English, and some speak only English, the whole society may end up speaking English with many French elements. And that this can happen, we can actually see from the history of Europe. This is exactly what happened to English in the 11th century. In the 11th century, Normans from northern France conquered England. It was in 1066 that the people, French-speaking people, entered the British Isles and brought with them the French language. Now, these were not the majority of the society, but they were the leaders. They became the new leaders, the kings of English-speaking society. So French became a high standard, high prestige language. And this led to changes in English. So the Old English language in the 11th century became more similar to French because the leading group of the society spoke French or English with a French accent. So we can see changes in English at this point on all levels of the language. In English, the sounds za and ja and va became phonological. They came to be used to distinguish words. They were not phonological before that. The sounds existed in English, but they only occurred spontaneously in some contexts. But with the introduction of French, these became real phonemes due to French influence. Then English case endings. We saw examples of language change, how English changed, became more simple over time. This started at this point, that case endings and verb endings, like the morphology, was simplified. This usually happens when there are many L2 speakers of a language. When many speakers learn the language, don't learn it perfectly, and then just make it more simple. So the morphology of English changed. English word order changed. It became more like French. French word order is pretty strict subject, verb, object. So I eat rice. This is what you have in English today. In English today, you also have the pretty strict word order, subject, verb, object, SVO. Before the 11th century, and also for a few centuries after this, but gradually becoming less frequent, English had a different word order. The rule in English was that the verb always comes in the second position of the sentence. whatever comes first, the verb has to be second. So of course, if you have subject, verb, object, verb is in second position as well. But imagine a sentence where you have an adverb like today. In modern English, you still say, today I go to school. Or today I eat Chinese food. Now, in earlier English, before French influence came in, you would say something like, today eat I Chinese food. Because today is the first element in the sentence, and the verb has to come second. So then you change the word order from subject, verb, object to verb, subject, object. Today eat I Chinese food. Now, this is not used anymore in modern English. In modern English, it's always SVO, just like in French. And of course, many French loan words come into English. The English vocabulary today is, well, much more than 50% French or Latin vocabulary. There's not much original English left. And a very, well, clear example is words like beef, pork, and mutton. These are all French words, bœuf, porc, and mouton, which came into English, and they're all only used for food. So beef is only what you eat, but it's the meat of a cow. So the English word cow is used for the animal, and the French word beef is used for what you eat of it, the meat of the cow. In French, beef is just cow. And pork, porc in French, just means pig. So in French, you see pig on the field and you see beef on the field. But in English, you see the pig and the cows, but you eat beef and pork. So there was a differentiation of meaning when these French loanwords came into English. But this is just an example to show you how much change can be caused by language contact. And in this case, the language contact was from the high society spreading to all parts of the society. So if you look at the factors that are important in language contact, factors that are relevant in causing language change through contact. Of course, the linguistic structure of the languages may be important. If the languages are similar to each other, influence is easier. So it's easier for French and Italian to influence each other than it would be for Chinese to influence French, because Chinese and French are very different. Italian and French are similar. Then the transparency of the expression that you take from another language. If you understand the elements of an expression, if you understand how it's made up, then it's easier to borrow it. It's easier to take it over into your language, a target language, either as a whole, as matter borrowing, or just the structure replacing the words by your own words as pattern borrowing. Then similar sounding expression that's already in the target language. If your language has a word that sounds similar to word in the source language with a similar meaning, then it's easy to just take this element. So one example to illustrate this, in English, if you want to go on with something, make a logical sequence to something, you say, so. I can say, it's raining, so I'm not going out today. This so in English connects expressions in some logical way. Now, I've heard Burmese people living in Europe for many years, Europe and America for many years, and of course speaking English fluently. And when they speak Burmese, they would say things like, so this so, of course, in Burmese, you have da so or aso or aso in colloquial Burmese as well, which has a very similar function to the English so. So it's very easy to just drop the da or e or a and just keep the so, which sounds the same as the English so, and it has a similar meaning. So it's not really clear. So you heard the so. So it's not really clear if when Burmese living in Western countries use so as a connective, they mean the English so, or they mean the Burmese aso. So this is a case where we have a similar sounding word with similar sounding meaning, then it's easier to have the influence there. Then one important point also is the prestige of the source language. You would rather borrow words from a language that you consider to be superior to your own language than from a language that you think is below your own language. So the social hierarchy again comes into play here. So Burmese would rather borrow words from Pali or English than from Shan or Mon. This is especially relevant for matter replication because loan words are more conscious than structural borrowings. In many cases, when you have pattern replication, you don't even know it, you don't feel it, that you do something funny with your language. So the status of the source language is important. You feel it superior in some way to your own language. And of course, the speakers of this language, if they're influential people speaking a language, then you may be, you're more likely to take over things from them. So the status of the speakers is very important. Then on the other hand, a language that has high prestige usually has many second language speakers, many speakers learning this language, and very often they don't learn it correctly or not completely correctly. That means that the prestige language may change towards the subordinate language to some extent. So if many speakers of another language learn English but don't learn it perfectly, then the English of that society will be different. It will become more similar to the non-dominant languages. This is, for example, what happened in India. Indian English today is an official variety of English, and this Indian English is very much influenced by local Indian languages. And these local languages are very diverse, of course, but they all have influenced Indian English to some extent. So English, of course, is seen as the high prestige language of the colonial leaders, of the colonial elite. So everyone, or many people, learned English and used English, but still there were many Indian original elements that were stuck in this English variety. So you see, there is influence that goes both ways, from high to low and from low to high. In some cases, when different languages or language groups are used in a region with much interaction, they can become more similar to each other. So there may be areal convergence. You cannot say then that there is borrowing from language A to language B. Maybe there was, but we don't see it anymore. We can just see that the languages are similar to each other, and they were not similar to each other 1,000 years ago, or more than 1,000 years ago. So this is what happened in Europe. So European languages, in linguistics, we call standard average European. This is about this area. They're all very similar. Of course, different lexicon, different pronunciation, different words, but the structures of these languages are very similar. So, of course, there are many loan words among these languages, matter replication. So these are all German words here, loan words, Telefon, Automobil, Kaiser, Keller, and these are all loan words from Latin or Greek or French or English, like cool, out, downloaden, scannen, with the German en infinitive ending. So these are just loan words that you have basically everywhere in Europe and also in other places. These are not very interesting. More interesting are cases of pattern replication, where the patterns are taken over. So the English word president, for example, comes from the French word président, and in German, well, we can call it Präsident, but it's also Vorsitzender. Now, the interesting part is that pre in president means before, and sitzend means sitting. So in German, we have vor, which means before, in front of, and sitzend, which means sitting. So it's the same elements, the same construction, but using German words. And the same is true for the other examples here. For example, survive. Survive in English is a loan from French, matter, borrowing, French survivre. Sur means above, and vive means to live. In German, we take the two same elements, but use German words, überleben. So these are pattern replications. We only use the pattern. These are also called calques in English, when you make up new words by using patterns from another language. And then another kind of pattern replication, where we don't really know where it came from, is the way of making the perfect tense. You all know that in English, I have said, I have eaten. This have doesn't really make sense. It's not, I have said, you know, byoshide. It's not about shide, this have said, it's just the tense. Now, it doesn't make logical sense, but all languages in Europe do this. In German, ich habe gesagt. In French, j'ai dit. In Serbian, mam kazane. In Albanian, un kam thone. It's always the same thing. It's always have and the verb to make perfect or past tense. So this is something that just spread all over Europe in sort of convergence, making the languages structurally more similar. And then the last point here about language contact, mixed languages. When people who speak different native languages have to work together, have to communicate, and there is no language that they really share, then in many cases we can observe that a new language arises. And this new language is called Creole or Pidgin. Pidgin usually is used for languages that are just ad hoc communication tools to make yourselves understood. Creoles are then the next generation, when children grow up speaking only this language as a first language, then they have fully developed grammatical systems. Now, the interesting point about these Pidgin and Creole languages is that they usually take the vocabulary from one language and the grammar from another language. Examples here are of Tok Pisin. Tok Pisin is the official language, national language of Papua New Guinea, just to the east of Indonesia, north of Australia. So if you look at these examples, Emi man belong me, he's my husband. These are all English words. Him is man belong me. The grammar is not English at all, but the words are English. The grammar is rather Oceanic or Papuan. Wan pla man ikam. Wan pla man. Wan pla is one fellow. So you don't only say one man, you say wan pla man. This is similar to Burmese, where you cannot say the yao cha, but you have to say yao cha the yao. You need a classifier. This classifier in Tok Pisin, they use bela. Bela from the English fellow. Also with demonstratives, this, you don't say this man, but this blaman, this fellow man. He, like him, this fellow marry. This man likes this woman. So you see, the words are English, but the grammar is not English at all. So this is a really mixed language. There are two different parts of linguistic systems that come together and form a whole new language. And Tok Pisin is an official language now, so it's not something that just happens spontaneously. It's a fully developed language. It's written, there is newspapers and everything in Tok Pisin. So to sum up this, language contact, general part, it's important to always keep in mind that most individuals are exposed to more than one language to some extent. No one really grows up speaking only one language or using only one language. And this is especially true for societies. So no language is there that is not influenced by other languages. So again, prescriptive linguists who try to keep French as pure as possible, it cannot work because French is in contact with other languages. It is influenced. Language contact is the second important factor leading to language change. We saw laziness as an important factor in language change. Contact is another important factor. How languages can influence each other in language contact depends much on the social structure of the speakers. Linguistic factors may be there, but it's much more important to look at the social factors. Language contact can result in changes in all domains of the languages involved. So there's nothing that cannot change through contact. And this influence can go both ways. Like low prestige language can influence high prestige and the other way around. Drivers of contact-induced change can either be high prestige groups. So if your teacher or some singers, movie stars, do speak a language in a funny way, this may influence your way. You may copy them more because they're high prestige in the society. So they may be important drivers of language change. Or, and this is very often not taken into consideration, big numbers of L2 speakers, of second language speakers, who don't speak the language perfectly, maybe. They may cause the language to change. And we will look at this in terms of languages of Myanmar on Friday. And there is a lot going on of influence, especially also of smaller languages, influence in Burmese. So thanks for your attention and feel free to ask questions now, if you have any. Any questions or comments?
Sir, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yes, in language context, you said about bilingual, like when she forget the words in English, she use French word. So when we communicate, it also happen like we forget how to use that word. Like we forgot how to use that word, and you just say, I don't know how to say that, and it's just lost in your mind. So is there any concern with language or memory, like temporary language loss or just memory loss?
It does not necessarily need to language loss, because we talked about this. Language is very flexible. Language is not stable. So words can be replaced at any time in the language. So if you speak Burmese, and of course you speak Burmese perfectly, and you will talk about Zeishare to lower the price. But if you use now the English discount all the time, so go to the market and everyone just says, oh, the discount chili, discount payment. They don't say Zeishare payment, they just say discount payment. At some point, as language is a habit, language use is a habit, you may not, maybe you cannot think of the Zeishare at the moment. And then you just use the English again and again. And the more you do this, the more you forget the Burmese expression. But it's not really forgotten. It's just not there at the top of your brain. Then when you go back and you read a book and you see Zeishare in this book, then of course you remember it and you know what it means. So this is not language loss. It's just gradual change of the habit.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, then I think we can stop here and we'll meet again on Friday for a closer look at Myanmar and language contact here. So thank you very much for your attention and stay safe, all of you. See you soon.